We're going to talk about your book, obviously, but before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your current role at Google?
Interesting career story. I started out in cross-cultural studies for my undergrad, so nothing related to supply chain at all. But I ended up falling in love with supply chain through the international MBA program at USC, which is, where we met, and really just fell in love with like being able to manage like physical products and seeing that process of how it's made and the end-to-end flow. Really just fell in love with that through lots of experiences through the MBA. I studied Arabic as part of that program, and so this was during the Arab Spring, and pretty wild stories. Was in Cairo for the coup when LCC took over, and pretty formative there. I was working with like a solar energy startup at that time, and because of the unrest, I had to shift my internship as part of that program to Italy. And there was a company there called the Prismian Group that I got an internship with. Post graduation, I managed a team up in the Northeast at a specialty cable manufacturing company. So kind of end-to-end supply chain there, everything from procurement to production planning, logistics, warehouse management, and a lot of interesting stuff there, like around defense cables and bridge cables and just kind of weird stuff you wouldn't even think about that actually contributes to the interconnectivity of the world. So when I moved to North Carolina, I got a really cool opportunity within the elevator division of the Prismian Group, managing a global supply chain team across China, South America, all over the US and Europe. Got to travel a lot to these places, was involved in a lot of like warehouse moves, kind of reworking some of the production planning, and really got to use the data analytics part of my education there too, rolling out kind of a new ML forecasting program for my team from the ground up, and kind of just really focusing on process optimization across the board. Uh, then, right around the beginning of the pandemic, I got the opportunity to transition to tech supply chain at Google, where I am today. And at Google, I'm on a team that manages deployment of capacity in the data centers. So this is everything from new servers that go in to reworking the servers as they exist within the data center to then their end of life cycle. My specific team that I manage is on the upgrading portion of that. So we work everything again end-to-end supply chain from order management to procurement, working with the procurement teams and logistics teams, and then even very hands-on with some of the data center work as well to actually reconfigure these servers. So very different world from the Prismian group, but it's just kind of rounded out my career a little bit with these different experiences. Also, I did write a book, which I guess is what we're a little bit talking about today a little bit, called Supply Chain for Startups, published that in the fall of 2021. And that's just was a really good way to just encapsulate kind of my vision of how supply chain works and should work into a book, and has led to a lot of interesting conversation and engagement with startups and people like you, Pedro.
You're right. As you were a student in the international MBA program at the University of South Carolina, I was working there along with all your great classmates. So it's good to see this new iteration of you doing what you're doing and obviously incorporating a lot of your global experiences through that program into the work that you do now. Talking about your role as the author of Supply Chain for Startups, I recall you mentioning that one of the reasons for writing the book was to address some of the common mistakes that you perceived among startups with regards to supply chain. So, what are some of those mistakes?
The real impetus behind it was I invested in a few Kickstarter startups, and you invest in these, and then you kind of wait, you see these updates, and it just they were always late on delivering, and some of them never even delivered at all. And so I wanted to understand why this happened, and I started digging in, like talking to some of them about their experiences. And I think there's a few key mistakes. I think one of them, which is forms kind of the structure of my book, is the idea that you need to map your supply chain so that you can design for supply chain from the get-go when you're making a product. It's a physical product focused book, so that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. And I think a lot of startups are so focused on the product itself and getting that to market, and they're making all these decisions that are difficult to make and hard to make, and are kind of like feel so much pressure that you need to make them quickly. that they don't often just take a step back and think about, okay, how will things flow through the supply chain now in this very initial state that I have? And how could this potentially scale in the future? Planning for scale is really important too. That's similar to mapping, but always having in your mind of how scalable is this process that I'm launching right now? Because it's so difficult to go back and rework things later on that it's going to take a lot more money than you think. So oftentimes spending a little bit more initially for something that is scalable versus something cheaper that you will have to move factories or whatever in the future if your product does take off is probably worth the extra money and time simply to prepare yourself for that future. And then I think along with all of this, data management is a piece that startups sometimes miss out on. And it's kind of the like non-sexy part of supply chain of just like, what is my BOM? Where's my data located? How am I going to manage all of this information that flows in and out of various nodes in the supply chain? But it really is in like absolutely critical. Information kind of makes a supply chain run well. And if you don't have good tracking of where that data is located, you don't have like a good focus on your BOM structure and how that's going to scale as well as you move between different contract manufacturers or even internal manufacturing. It just again causes so much pain later on as you need to like rework and follow industry standards to actually scale up with the big players that you can lose a lot of time, but also it can really hurt your margins later on. Because really the goal is to have you have razor thin margins or negative margins at the beginning, but that goal is you're always chasing the positive margins. And if you have to go back and constantly rework stuff, it really sets you back on that path to profitability.
From a layperson's perspective, when I think of supply chain, I think of an adaptive methodology that allows businesses to identify the flow of goods and services and how that flow itself can be maximized for profitability and efficiency. So, firstly, is that a pretty good summary? And second, what are some of the more relevant supply chain complexities that startups need to address or should address as they strive to scale their business and grow their business?
You're exactly right about flow. I think flow is the fundamental idea of supply chain in my mind, is that it's the flow of everything, of data, as we were talking about previously, materials, how things flow through manufacturing lines, logistics. I mean, even how the money is flowing across all the different partners, and it's about a supply flowing through various chains of people, entities, groups, and making sure that that happens seamlessly and smoothly really is the overall mission of a supply chain manager, or really just a company in general. And I think as you think about that flow, there are definitely a lot of complexities because it's one thing, I'm at Google right now, and we are in Google Cloud, which is definitely a growing part of Google, but it's still a very like big company, and so there's a lot of established processes, and so there's definitely a line that you're trying to go up to scale quickly, but there's also a lot of processes and things that already exist. So when you're in a startup, you don't have a lot of those processes there. You're trying to build the process while trying to maintain growth and keep a lot of things in tension. I think one of the things that's probably obvious to any hardware startup founder is just the tension between cost and quality, and trying to maintain that because you probably have investors that you're responsible for, and you have a limited supply of money. You have your burn rate, and there's the tendency to skimp in certain areas so that you can kind of keep below that burn rate. There's also sometimes a tendency to be like, if it's a very engineering led startup, they may have a huge focus on like, okay, this is the optimal idea. This is like the optimal way that we're going to make this product. And that can actually cost a significant amount more. And so this tension between kind of the like efficiency and cost piece and kind of the innovation piece is really hard to balance. When you're in a big company, you have a lot more supplier power around these contracts and negotiating power. When you're a little supplier, You kind of just have to take it as it comes from a pricing standpoint. You don't really like, you can promise and say like, hey, we think we're going to have this much volume, and so you should give us a better deal. But as a supplier, you don't necessarily have that much confidence that there's going to be that long-term business. So I think it's really important to um, build those relationships with those companies and have a more relational focus on the procurement side. Another complexity is this tension between over and under forecasting. And so I think this tension between over forecasting and like from a sales perspective, like you want to say, oh, we are going to sell this much. And then, the supply chain side or more efficiency side is like, ooh, but let's be more realistic. And then when your product comes to market, if you have excess demand, then you're not able to meet it, and there can be some like backlash from the market there, and you miss out on demand. But if you over forecast and you have all this excess supply of a V1 of a product that you are hopefully going to iterate on and improve, then you're just sitting on inventory that's wasted cash. So I don't think there's like a silver bullet to solve this problem. I think the thing is goes back to what you were saying just about adaptability, building that into your supply chain of not being so rigidly wherever you can, not being so rigidly tied to a forecast number, but being able to adapt, build in buffers so that you're able to react quickly when demand increases or scale back quickly when you see it decrease.
Thank you, Jonathan. This has been a really good conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise on supply chain. It's obvious throughout your book and this conversation here that supply chain is a core fundamental of doing business, whether you're a global player and certainly for the startups.